Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Ana María Silva Campo, professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Prof. Thank you so much for being with us in that very beautiful part of the world. And I can see out your window some of the natural beauty of trees that really make
It's
such very
beautiful,
spectacular. Yeah.
and there's a lot of pollen this time of year.
Are you suffering?
I was suffering a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah. I'm, when I was young, I suffered horrendously from this. Nowadays, I get it for about 3 weeks only, and it's not very
Yeah.
nice, but I know it's going to end, whereas it lasted all season when I was a little one. Oh my God. And my eyes would actually shut at times.
Oh my
The
God,
worst
that's
place ever for
terrible.
me, funnily enough, is London, where there's almost no natural life, right? But also Madrid. You get it terribly in Madrid, where Ayuso is trying to destroy all greenery, as you may be aware.
Yeah.
Prof, I start with my cliche questions, which are to inquire what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you.
Yeah, thank you for those questions. It's always nice to slow down and think about those basics. Um, I'm finding a lot of energy in interacting with my 4-year-old. I have an energetic 4-year-old boy, and just seeing the world through his eyes, hearing the stuff he comes up with is amazing and also exhausting. So maybe that could also be the part slowing me down sometimes. Concerning raising a child in the United States right now, um, I want to make the right choices and I want to be intentional in how I raise my son. He is half Colombian. And yeah, I just worry about what the country will be like when he's older. That's a concern. And what were the other two? Slowing down.
You've
I
done
already covered that
dynamizing, you've done
one.
impeding, and really preoccupying and interesting, I think you've covered as well, Prof.
I think so.
I
Yeah.
think you have. And I understand what you're saying. Our little people are incredibly important. An appalling anti-Semite, racist, and pig dog, Winston Churchill, did have one great saying, albeit sexist. Some of our greatest men started out life as children. And of course, it's also true
Yeah.
of girls
Also true.
turning into great women. Uh, but in all seriousness, it is a worry. By the way, we're having an intervention staged by Chinguri. Uh, Chinguri is a Basque militant, but also very timid. And Chinguri
Oh,
es euskera, si puedes creerlo, es euskera por hormiga, which means ant.
wow.
Now, why would you
Yeah.
name a cat after another species? Why name a cat after an ant? I don't know. But he was a street adoptee in Madrid, and he gets very, very jealous when I'm
When he doesn't
talking.
have your attention. Yeah.
Yes. And this reminds me, I was going to ask you about this with your son. My father wrote books, Prof. When I was 2, before I could speak, I didn't speak until I was about 3, 3.5. I went into his study and I pulled his typewriter onto the floor, forever breaking one of the keys,
Oh.
and then walked out of the room. Rather like what Chinguri is doing now, because he's jealous that I'm talking to you. What's your son's attitude to cultural production on your part?
Um, I think the only part he sees me doing is going into the office and yes, typing on the keyboard.
Right.
And so for him, he wants to play office with me. And that means a pretend keyboard in front of him, maybe in the air.
Oh,
And he also talks to students, pretend students, because he has seen me do that at work as well.
oh my God. He's a little more developed
Yeah.
and aware than I was. That's a fantastic story.
And he also says that he is a professor at UNC. I asked him, "Oh, wow, what do you teach?" And he said, "I teach basketball."
Of course he does. And
Yep.
some listeners may not know that, of course, Michael Jordan is perhaps the most famous of many famous basketballing alum from the University of North
Exactly.
Carolina. And he did go back and finish his degree, didn't he, as his sort of promise
I think he
to become
did,
a coach.
but to be honest with you, I do not know. I know there's basketball happening around me, and that's about it.
Yeah. Well, you better man up, as they say on this, in terms of keeping up with your son. If he is
Yes.
professor of basketball, you need to show interest, right? Or no? But in any
Yeah.
event, in
Yeah.
all seriousness, we're not here to talk about that. But I did want to ask you one thing about him. Before we started recording, we were discussing whether we would record in Spanish or English in terms of the desired public and so on. And I'm wondering whether you're raising him bilingually, whether that's difficult, how it's going.
Yeah. We're raising him bilingual. We speak only Spanish at home, and so that makes everything easier. So
Yeah,
his first language was Spanish, and it's his strongest language, and he's getting all his English outside the home, daycare mostly. Yeah,
right,
it hasn't been that difficult so far. Although he has started coming home with vocabulary and expressions from daycare that probably he can't find a way to translate into Spanish.
right.
Um, so he goes back to English more often these days. So what I do is I just repeat if he says, "Mami, quiero el pink." I just repeat back, "Ah, quieres el rosado."
Hey,
And just, don't correct him or anything,
yeah.
but tell him the word he's looking for in a way
Lovely.
that, he doesn't quite realize.
No, that's great. That's great. So, Prof, getting on to your work, much of it is about a place that's very, very dear to my heart, Cartagena de Indias in Colombia. A truly amazing city, but one wrought and fraught by tragedy, racism, and throughout its history, but perhaps especially now, sexual violence.
Yes.
Now, what you've done is something quite extraordinary. You've gone back to look at just these sorts of issues hundreds of years ago. How did you do it, and what did you find out?
Well, I grew up in Bogota, many, many kilometers away from Cartagena. Mm, I did my history undergrad degree in Colombia, and I never learned about Cartagena. I never learned about the history of Cartagena, um, even though for those listening who might be from Colombia or have visited Cartagena, one of the main features you encounter when you walk into the city is the colonial Spanish colonial architecture. So clearly a place with a very uh, present legacy of colonialism from the Spanish period, and this was really not covered when I was an undergraduate studying history in Colombia. So I started to wonder about the history of this place. Um, and in graduate school at the University of Michigan, was when I learned that Cartagena was the first and the main port for disembarking African captives to all of Spanish South America during the colonial period. I never knew this, and I thought that was fascinating. I wanted to know more about the role of the city in this trade in enslaved people from Africa. And I thought it would be really easy to do a history project about those people in the city. I got to Cartagena because I saw there was, in the what is now the Inquisition's museum, the Inquisition Palace, now the Museo Histórico de Cartagena, there was a little office there that said Archivo, archive. And so I thought, okay, there's an archive, so I'll just go in and do the research. So I walked into the archive and I asked the archivist for their colonial era materials, and the guy just looked at me and said, our oldest documents are from the 19th century. There's nothing here prior to that. So, first of all, finding out what had happened to the local archive, I could tell you about that later, but I ended up having to look at records elsewhere, mostly of places that would have administrative connections to Cartagena, that would have gotten copies of documents or reports from Cartagena going outwards, and that would have ended up in an archive through those
Mm.
other processes. So Bogota was a place with a lot of these archives. But the gold mine I found were the Inquisition archives, which are in Madrid. So I started looking at those records. The Inquisition, this tribunal that investigated and prosecuted people who were considered to be religious or moral deviant. The Inquisition has a lot of their trials or summaries of the trials for not practicing Catholicism the way they should. Um, but I was not interested in that piece. Several people have written about that material. What captivated me were the financial records of the Inquisition, because that's where I could find ties to the actual city of Cartagena. And the first record I saw within the financial archive that really caught my attention was this bundle it's about 600 pages handwritten from the 1630s with an inventory of confiscated goods and houses that the Inquisition took away from a group of women of African descent who owned property in the city center and who were accused of witchcraft. And so I had 600 pages of their belongings, of what their houses looked like and the objects they had, the clothes, everything was taken away after they were convicted. And this record really opened up for me a beautiful opportunity to take this record of loss and dispossession and try to build out from it, to try to reconstruct what those women's neighborhoods might have looked like, what their households might have looked like, and then what happened to those houses later on. So I started tracing the women's property across the Inquisition's financial records. The houses remained in the Inquisition's archive because the Inquisition sold the houses to other people, white men of European ancestry on credit. So those debts remain in the Inquisition's archive for decades. So basically, I could track the transfer of property
Mm.
that the Inquisition did from women of African descent to men of European ancestry, changing a lot of the composition of the neighborhood that is today around Plaza Santo Toribio,
Mhm.
that part of the city. Yeah.
To give a bit of context for US listeners, the closest I can think of would be the old part of New Orleans, which is
Mm.
very similar to the old part of Cartagena, and of course had a French and briefly a Spanish colonial history. The other thing, and you'll correct me if I get this wrong, Prof, is that many US listeners and listeners elsewhere may not be aware that the Portuguese and the Spanish kidnapped and enslaved many more Africans than the British or the French for the Americas, the vast majority of people. The Portuguese sold lots of them to the Spanish, actually, right? So there is this
Yes.
massive aspect that is often forgotten in the sort of monumental world of historiography and political debate about slavery in the United States. You're nodding, so I think I've more or less got that right. But
Yes, yes, exactly.
this wonderful story, this sort of detective story that you outline in a couple of your articles I've read too, about going to Cartagena to find what should be there and locating it in Spain. One of those multiple colonial ironies. The fact that the museum used to be the office of the Inquisition. But the other thing is, this is yet another crime against African descended women on top of the initial crime, could we call it the original sin, of kidnapping and enslavement, which is these people have made lives for themselves, which are then seized. Now, the question is the seizure done cynically? There's a particular woman who accuses them of witchcraft. Is she making shit up in order for this dispossession to occur? Or is this some sort of genuine belief that arises from racial issues? Is there any evidence about that sort of question?
Yeah, that is the question that I think most people who work on these kinds of records and archives have to deal with because we're getting the evidence from the Inquisition itself, right? So the inquisitors are writing about witchcraft because that's what they see.
Yeah,
So for us, the historians, we have to see how we deal with that information and take
right,
distance from it.
right.
Um, so I think I teach a class on the history of early modern witchcraft. And so this question is present not just for my case in Cartagena, but elsewhere. And it has to do with who gets accused within a certain context, right? If it's a moment of famine, a moment of plague, um, or something like that, maybe in early modern Germany, then accusations of witchcraft tend to peak, and the people accused are often women, and they're often people who are marginal for in
Right.
whatever way. So for the case of Cartagena, I think this was a city in which the trade itself, it's a port city, there's a lot of economic opportunity and demand for services, for sailors arriving, that kind of thing. So that economy allowed women who had been enslaved
Mm,
to purchase their own freedom, mm, many times through what I could tell were activities related to midwifery. Is that theme comes up in many of the accusations, um, in ways kind of like, oh, such and such was visiting a newborn baby, and the baby died after her visit. Hence, she might be a witch. So a lot of stuff around newborns, around mothers giving birth. So connecting the dots, I think midwifery, some activities like that, kind of health and ritual around that kind of stuff could have raised suspicions in a moment in which women of African descent were not supposed to become, I wouldn't say wealthy, but they were able to purchase property, houses in the city center. They were certainly not rich. They were certainly not the most powerful in the city, but they were visible. They were making money in a way that was not accepted by the society around them. And so that triggered part of the persecution. And in Cartagena specifically, there were white women doing similar things. And when I say white women, I'm referring to Spanish women or women of Spanish descent who were born in Cartagena or in the Americas. They were also practicing similar things, but the accusation against them was sorcery, which was not as bad as witchcraft.
Punishment wasn't
In
as intense.
Cartagena,
Yeah.
it was not as intense, and the charge of witchcraft always, um, in theology, meant that people had done a pact with the devil, and that was the main piece. Sorcery did not involve a pact with the devil. And so, even though the practices were very similar, the inquisitors of Cartagena did prosecute people along racial lines and use the charge of witchcraft against people of African descent, mostly women.
Now, Prof, again, please forgive me for extrapolating back from today to then. But again, for listeners unfamiliar with the context, most directly African descended, let's say people in Colombia live on the coast, Pacific and Atlantic, not all, but most. And they are really stereotyped appallingly elsewhere. And they have a big thing about the interior. The political economic powerhouses, of course, are Bogota and Medellin, but they're also the media powerhouses. And one of the big issues, and again, you'll correct me if I get this wrong, is again and again and again in narco novelas, in other forms of popular drama, characterizing Black women on the coast as sexually, in inverted commas, available, in inverted commas, free, always derided, always put into this sexualized box. So, in terms of the contemporary, is that a fair remark, do you think, when it comes to stereotypes and concerns? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
So, next question is, does that have any kind of antecedent in the fact that, okay, they were midwives, but they were involved in this birthing moment, this moment of intense, in one sense, sexuality, in another sense, not complicated category. Is there a history, is there a line across time to do with Black women and sexuality that's related here?
Absolutely, and not just in the case of Cartagena and the specific story that I'm telling. There's a broader context for that. In Latin America during the colonial era, the gender dynamics were structured around the idea of honor. And this is a very kind of foreign concept to us, but it was one of the ways in which people made sense of social life. So honor was tied to um, the male head of household. And so a rich white male head of household would have had the most amount of honor. Then his dependents, women, children, servants, enslaved people, would also have a way to kind of uphold the entire family unit's honor by if they were a single woman in the household, being sexually respectable and, not getting pregnant before marriage and things like that. And within that structure, the enslaved people were the ones who were considered to have the least amount of honor. And the black women specifically, would have seen as lacking honor. One, because their sexuality was part of the slavery system, right? So enslaved women were supposed to be sexually available to their masters. Many of them bore their supposed owners. I say supposed because, nobody really owns another human being. They were supposed to be available sexually, and that was part of the labor they were supposed to offer to the household. And for a male white head of household, having sexual access to an enslaved woman was part of how he performed his own honor as well. And so this conception and this system has remained present in a lot of Latin American dynamics into today. And it comes from that understanding of race, sexuality, and gender kind of working together.
Another thing people may not be aware of is that, as in the United States, the kind of struggles between Britain and Spain in the case of Latin America in the 18th century, early 18th century, mid 18th century, the struggles between the nascent United States and Britain saw the British trying to buy support from enslaved peoples and indigenous peoples by promising them freedom and power and wealth. This applied in what we now call Colombia, just as it did in what was already the United States by 1812. What's the situation with indigenous women and accusations of sorcery or witchcraft as opposed to African descended ones?
Yeah, that's a really important question and a really important distinction. Initially, the mission of the Spanish colonizers involved evangelizing, bringing Catholicism, teaching the gospel, and baptizing indigenous people in the Americas. And that's part of how these Iberian empires, Spain and Portugal, justified their taking the territories and the sovereignty away from indigenous rulers and leaders, which was very problematic at the time, right? Going back to Spain and telling the people that the Spanish had taken sovereignty away from a legitimate ruler like Moctezuma or Atahualpa, that was a problem. And so the way to justify a lot of this was by saying, okay, but now all of these indigenous people's souls can be saved
Yeah.
through baptism and conversion. And so the idea was that indigenous people were children in the faith. They were young to the faith. They were new to Catholicism. They didn't know it very well. And so indigenous people were not under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. The Inquisition did
Oh,
not
I
have
didn't
the
know that.
right
Oh, how interesting.
to
Uh-huh.
prosecute indigenous people
Uh,
because it would be kind of unfair, right? To
well, the
go
Inquisition
after
is a
people
very
who are
fair
new in the faith.
institution, as we know.
Exactly. Exactly. But that was the argument at the time. Um, In contrast, people of African descent, they were also, many of them, new to the faith. Many of them were baptized by Jesuits and Capuchins on the west coast of Africa right before the Middle Passage, the voyage via the Atlantic Ocean toward the Americas, um, without any instruction about what it meant to be converted. Um, but the argument there for the Iberian authorities, the Spanish and the Portuguese, was that Africans had been exposed to Christianity prior at some point, right? Like Africa was not a newly discovered continent. And so the argument there was like, well, Christianity has been known in some places in Africa, and so Africans in general are not new to the faith.
Oh, and they don't get a pass in a sense.
And
They're
so they did
expected
not
to
get a
perform
pass.
100%. Oh, thank you for sharing that with me. I wanted to throw in the reason I mentioned the British versus the Spanish in Cartagena or around Cartagena and the War of 1812 is that these things help to generate a notion in the Americas that Black people and Indigenous people are disloyal to the nation,
Mhm.
potentially or actually, that they're not really committed. Now, why should there be, would be one question, but it is interesting. Now, that said, I think I'm right in saying, Prof. Anna, that this Colombian national anthem refers to the heroic Cartageneros, by which they mean criollos, por supuesto, resisting the British, the Mosquito Wars of the 18th century. And they have that role historically, but it's a role of helping to defend what's becoming Colombia from the British, that then also becomes part of getting independence from Spain. But very little of it is about the actual population. And this is also a time, or becomes a time, when Bolivar is talking, much like Vasconcelos a century later, about the idea of how this civilizing mission you've spoken about was incarnate in the Spanish. And it produced this magical mestizaje or mixedness with the committed savagery of the indigenous. Apart from all the problems with that ideology and history, it excludes Black people, doesn't it? Pretty much. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Um, and it's very telling that, as you may know, Bolivar never um, he never granted legal freedom to the people he held as slaves.
And he is
So,
the
yeah.
great liberator.
The
Yeah.
great liberator,
Great
exactly.
liberator. Just like Thomas Jefferson is the great theorist of democracy. I mean, we laugh at these things, but it's either laugh or cry or both. Now, did the Inquisition have a different kind of incarnation in Latin America from the one that it had in other parts of the world, or is it very unified?
That's a great question. The Inquisition was one of those very first legally homogenous institutions around the world, because during this time period, the period that I study from around 1580 to 1640, the Iberian kingdoms were united under Spain. So both Spain and Portugal were under the same crown. And so the Inquisition tribunals from the Iberian Peninsula itself to the Americas to Brazil and Goa under the Portuguese branch of the Inquisition, they were all kind of part of the same system. And when you look at it in the aggregate, it's pretty much a global institution. Um, So it had its unified legal um, methods and structures, but the way it worked locally, and this is part of what I study, was very specific to the context the Inquisition encountered in that place. So in Cartagena, for example, the main suspects originally, the reason why the crown established a tribunal in Cartagena was because there were a lot of Portuguese traders bringing African captives to the city during this era in which Spain and Portugal were one crown, under one crown. And these Portuguese merchants were heavily suspected of practicing Judaism in secret. So they were the main suspects.
Also, anti-Semitism is on the lists there in Cartagena de India.
Of course, and it's huge in the picture here.
I didn't know
And
that
so
about Cartagena. Yeah.
yeah, part of what I discovered was that the Inquisition went after people of African descent and women in witchcraft to leave the slave merchants alone for a while because their trade was so important to the city that if the Inquisition went after them,
Let's
the
find some
economy of Cartagena would
let's find
crumble.
some black witches and leave the Jews to help us make money instead.
The suspected Jews, yeah, we don't even know
Oh,
what
sorry,
these
right.
people's beliefs were, right?
But
Um,
maybe one of your names is Silva. Maybe they had names like that, which made them suspect in some sense. Yeah.
yes, yes, and there's a whole history behind why the Portuguese were suspected of being secret Jews. But so in Cartagena, the Inquisition didn't go after folks like that initially. They did eventually prosecute them, but kind of later on. Um, in the Iberian Peninsula, crypto Jews or New Christians, as they were known at the time, they were the main suspects.
Right. Right.
And so it was very contextual the way in which the
Yeah.
Inquisition worked
Yeah.
in each of its locations.
In any massive geopolitical endeavor, that's going to be true, isn't it? But you're saying it's pretty homogeneous despite that. One of the things that people don't know about the expulsion of Jewish folks from the Iberian Peninsula is exactly what you're alluding to, which is, in fact, lots of people converted. So, amongst the
Yes.
many things the Spanish and the Portuguese never accept is that most of all, they're Goths, like more than three-quarters of them have Gothic DNA. Secondly, they're Jews. And thirdly, they're Africans. Because, of
Yeah.
course, they couldn't possibly be any of these things. They're white Europeans, right?
Exactly, right.
Can I ask you a question about the history course you're teaching? And I definitely want to enroll. This comparative study of witchcraft issues, sorcery issues, and so on. Going back a century, there's been an historiographic debate about witchcraft of all sorts, Marxist, feminist, religious, who knows. What's the sort of current state of play in explaining this? You've already mentioned some economic determinations.
Yes. So I think witchcraft studies, the slice of that I look at is exclusively historical, so by work by historians. I don't work too much with anthropology and other kinds of fields, so I don't want to speak about this stuff I don't really know about. But in history, we're looking a lot at exactly what I was talking about, contexts. Who gets accused when? What is the religious belief that makes a witchcraft accusation even possible? What are the forces at play in
Mm.
terms of the political, The environmental, is this a moment of crisis? Is this a period of drought? Is there a epidemics going on during the time period?
Right.
Um, and we're also seeing stories of individual people. Not just, we're not talking about witchcraft, the phenomenon, but we're also drawn to the people as much as we can glean information about who they were, what happened, what were their lives like. Um, and actually, I don't know if that is a historiographic shift or a moment, or if it's just what I'm drawn to as a scholar. I'm very drawn to narrative. I'm very drawn to specific characters that readers can relate to. And so yeah. So I don't know if that's just what I gravitate more
Sure,
towards.
sure. Well, funnily enough, anthropologists love stories too. So, Prof,
Yeah.
your book that's about to come out, yes,
Yes.
is called The Inquisition's Gambit, Making Wealth and Race in Cartagena de Indias. Can you explain the subtitle a little bit? Making Wealth and Race.
Yes. So again, this goes back to the way I use financial records of the Inquisition. Um, because the main finding, the most surprising one, I think, is that when the Inquisition confiscated houses, property from people accused of heresy or deviance, I think historians tended to think that that was instrumental, right? Trying to get money out of people, and this is what the persecution was about.
Mm-hmm.
What I find is that there's a broader project, a long-term project in what the Spanish crown is trying to do through the Inquisition, which is to build a society in which good Christians, according to the crown's own standards, can perpetuate their families
Mm-hmm.
in the colonies.
Mm-hmm.
To do that, they need capital, they need money. And so part of what the Inquisition does with the confiscated property is to transfer it to good Christian families who can then use that property to make more money. And I was able to trace that process over decades throughout the 17th century because in the Inquisition's archive, if financial records and archives, I can really see the house going from a woman of African descent accused of being a religious deviant through witchcraft. And I see that same house in the hands of a Spanish family for decades. And that family is still making money, acquiring more properties throughout the decades. And so it's a broader project, right? In which, in the specific case of Cartagena, race is also important because Cartagena has all of this influx of African captives and their descendants who also start building families and households, and some of them obtaining freedom and some of them becoming wealthier. And so the Inquisition is correcting a dynamic that would have otherwise yielded a society in which people of African descent can also be at the economic top. And that doesn't end up happening, right?
I've got a fun story for you, Prof. When I lived there, I got to know some palenqueros who lived
Mm-hmm.
on the islands, right? So these are Colombian citizens, they're black, they speak perfect English with a Scottish accent. and they do the Scottish sword dance. They do not regard themselves as Colombian. They fetishize the Scottish and the English. And this is partly to do with the fact that the British Empire relied on the Scots often as its accountants. And some of these islands were at different times under the possession of the British or under the influence. Again, for people not knowing this, until the First World War, in the century between independence from Mexico and Portugal and the First World War, the British were really the dominant economic force in Latin America. It's only from the First World War on that it is the United States that has this massive role. And there are these holdout people for whom the British are actually good. And when they talk to me about this, I would say, I cannot believe you're telling me this. And they say, well, it's real for us because our contemporary oppressors are in Bogota and to a certain extent in Barranquilla or Cali. That's a
Wow,
pretty good story, Prof, no?
that's a wonderful story.
It really, I mean, these
Yeah.
intricate interconnecting sinews of empire, race, gender, memory, and contemporaneity are so important to understand and so complicated if you just adopt one through line, as it were. Now, speaking of that, I want to get back, if I could, my last question I wanted to put to you. And after that, I'd like to invite you to add anything you may wish, right? But my last question is something you alluded to very early on, that mysteriously, suddenly, what was an inquisition is now a museum. But the mysterious part is that everything from the Inquisition's period is not there. You said
Yeah.
that you had an explanation for that. I'd love to know.
Yeah. So for people unfamiliar with historical archives, these were repositories or basically rooms in somebody's palace or office, in which the judges, the local notaries, the local administrative people who work for the administration would keep all their papers. And so historians today rely on those very old papers that people saved back then, to go in and find traces and stories and patterns. So I went into the Cartagena archive thinking that the notarial records from the colonial era would be there, or the judicial records from the local judge would be there, or the mayor's records, things like that, or the cabildo, whatnot. Um, Cartagena was attacked by privateers or pirates, depending on which side of the story you are and how you want to call them. Um, 3 times at least. The they burnt the city down, so paper doesn't fare well under fire. So that's one of the explanations.
Huh?
Some of the archives and some of the papers were lost during these attacks on Cartagena by the English, by the French. English and French were the main ones. So fires, pirate
You're
attacks,
trying to liberate people. You're always
Cartagena.
trying to liberate people, Prof. Come on. Give us a break here.
Well, yeah. Anyway, Cartagena, for those of our listeners who might not know, is also a very hot and humid place. And so paper also doesn't like humidity, and moisture. So if you're thinking about records that have been sitting in somebody's office without the proper conditions, those are just going to disintegrate.
Got it.
So that also happened. And then whatever was left, um, the when the Spanish lost their battles against the independence leaders in the 19th century, they took the rest of the archive back to Spain with them. So the the most well-known figure in Colombia for this period is the Spanish guy Pablo Morillo. Um, and so he took a lot of the archive with him back to Spain. Supposedly, I have not been able to locate the records that he took with him. Um, so I don't know what happened with that rest of the archive.
Really amazing stories. Prof, to conclude, is there anything you'd like to add that might take the form of entirely new material we haven't touched on, or it may involve covering terrain we've already traversed at some level?
No, first would just love to thank you for having me and for giving me the opportunity to talk about this fascinating story that sometimes as a writer and as a scholar is hard to remember the bigger picture in which the story is embedded. Um, so I just loved talking about the different ways in which all of these forces of colonialism and gender dynamics and racial dynamics intersect even today. Most of the work I am continuing to do has to do with these dynamics. Still, I'm interested in doing a project about the significance of gold for people of African descent in Colombia during the colonial era. We have a lot about gold and indigenous people in the national heritage of Colombia. Um, and then today we have so many problems and tensions about illegal gold mining. But we don't know exactly what gold meant for the people doing the labor of mining during the colonial period who were people of African descent. So that's what I'm working on right now. And if listeners are interested in more of the work that I'm doing, um, they can look up the book title, The Inquisition's Gambit, Making Wealth in Race in Cartagena, Indias, which is now available for pre-order.
Wonderful. Great product placement, Prof. I love it. But many, many thanks for being with us. I learned a lot from reading a couple of your articles, and I've learned even more from talking to you today. It's really been terrific.